It's August 31st, 2023. Welcome to Axiom News Live, where every Thursday we engage strengths to catalyze change. Here we start with what's strong rather than what's wrong, and to lift up the stories of people whose work in the world we become connected to and care about. I'm your host, Peter Pula. Our guests today are James Locke. James is, among other things, co-founder and director of Opus Independence and Foundations Earth, and has been doing quite the work in creating and funding initiatives to shape dialogue and journalism in generative directions. James joins us from Sheffield, South Yorkshire in the UK. I thought we might have a headline for what James is up to, but it is going to be live and breaking news because he's going to discover what's most alive for him during our time together today. Our second guest is Peter Block. Peter is, among other things, author of Community, The Structure of Belonging, one of my favorite books. He has just returned from a journalism gathering in Philadelphia where reportedly good things happened. His work is also an inspiration for the newly forming School for the Common Good. We'll aim to chat a little bit about both of those wonderful happenings. Peter joins us from Cincinnati, Ohio. Welcome, James and Peter. It's good to be with both of you again. We spent time together before, so it's nice to reconnect and see what's coming alive in your world and your work in the world. So maybe we just start with why each of you said yes to our invitation to play in the live space today. James, why yes?
Because no seemed pretty irresponsible, and I'm a big fan of both Peters and Yvonne, of course, behind the scenes. Yeah, it felt like there was some synchronicity and some right timing. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Beautiful, wonderful. Thanks, James. And you, Peter, you're squeezing us in. Once you heard that James was going to join us, you've been we've been playing at booking this sort of connection between the three of us in a conversation for a while, and this time we've landed it. So maybe there's some of the reason why yes, Peter, but what are the reasons that are close to your heart for saying yes today?
Well, I try to say yes to unexpected invitations. And I always show up to want to be surprised, and I figured you two guys are a good shot at that. And I like James. You're a thoughtful human being, and I feel lonely because I value ideas much more than I do action. So when I find somebody who does both, it's very appealing. And I just like the way you take time to think as if thoughts matter. And to me, the journalism domain is something I'm sinking into. I'm beginning to think there is no more important element of transformation, no matter what you're up to, whether it's the church or the business or the enterprise. But the nature of the narrative and the story, I've always known it as an individual. And now I'm discovering it culturally and societally, that maybe journalism carries the possibility of an alternative future more powerfully than anything else. And that may not be true, but I'm going to act as if it's true for the next 57 minutes.
That sounds like a smashing idea.
So,
James, you've been acting as if it's true for a while.
Well, I think it is, but then I'm kind of also aware that as soon as I feel certain about something, I'm almost certainly wrong. So there's some of that going on here for me. I think the type of information that we receive at the moment is so deeply isolating and so separating for us, the reader, for us, the consumer. The idea that we consume news is a crazy idea. The passivity in the things that we receive and the expectations that the artifacts that we encounter have of us that are so limited. And we're in this kind of we're in a desperate kind of moment, aren't we? at the moment. There's a generational moment occurring where the quality of our information is acting as a detractor to our own agency. And when we think about the way in which we produce journalism, when we produce news, we produce stories, we're not thinking about what is the story asking of us. We're thinking about how many people is the story reaching. And I think that's probably an error.
What is it, James, that's so isolating about it? To go into that a little deeper, that it is isolating, it is separating. What is it about the way stories, news, journalism is constructed now? And I love what you said. It takes away my agency, but say a little bit more about what it is that's so isolating.
I mean, my sense is that the purpose of the things we read are not to enable us to make sense of the world. And because of that, our own relationships with the things that happen to us and the things that happen around us are unformed or ill-formed. And I think there's also something to do with the idea that the way that we talk about issues in the world, we talk about issues in isolation as opposed to talking about their intersection. So we talk about a cost of living crisis without talking about a health crisis. We talk about a health crisis without talking about a biodiversity and climate crisis, and so on and so forth. And so we present this very separate view of the world as if it could be categorized into issues. And I think really when we tell stories, as opposed to tell news, we're really looking at a more holistic framework that encounters much more tangents, much more diversity, much more intersection. And I think that's pretty important. And I'd also say that we have a view of the journalism industry at the moment, which is intrinsically tied to the way that we do representative democracy. And both are failing us, unfortunately. There's an expectation that an article that calls power to account has a corresponding democratic function to and sadly that is no longer the case. And so there becomes this kind of deeper question about what is the role of the information that we receive in the decision-making processes that we are involved in. And it remains unanswered at the moment, which I think is sad, but also hugely exciting, because that is not a problem that can remain unsolved.
I think that makes sense, the fact that these are all interconnected and we treat them as if they're separate stories, whether it's health or the environment or the economy. And I think what you've done is uncoupled. I like the fact you've uncoupled the idea that holding power accountable somehow has to do with democracy. Because that's a myth. It's a sales myth. It's a marketing strategy. Let's convince people that we're doing them a service in the way that we manipulate them, in the way we decide what matters. And there's a sentence that's stuck in my mind, and that is that the primary job of people at the top is to manage the news, not to produce anything, not to make anything happen, not to bring us together, not to give us insight, not to listen, but to manage the news. And the industry now is aligned with that. And it is exciting, gives us a sense of purpose. And I think what you do with your portfolio of efforts is something about that. I think as I quickly looked at your website and all the language you have, and you have head, heart, and hand boards. I love that. I assume those are board of directors and not physical planks that somebody's grabbing onto. And
it's art. It's art.
Yeah, it is. Anyway, so what does this lead you to do? So what difference is it making in your journalism, in what you pay attention to?
It's making. I mean, part of this journey for me began meeting Peter Buehler here and learning about generative journalism and working with you, Peter Block, around the possibility orientated questions. That was a real moment, an unveiling of a new approach for me. And I think increasingly we need to kind of recover some of the journalistic practices that we have abandoned over the decades. And we need to think quite clearly and cleverly about where it is appropriate to deploy different kinds of journalistic practice towards the end. Towards the end of how does somebody use this work to make a better sense of their world and their place in it. So I'm really interested in where is it appropriate to deploy solutions journalism as opposed to generative journalism? Where is it appropriate to deploy solidarity reporting as opposed to campaign reporting? Where is it appropriate to deploy watchdog journalism, which of course is the dominant form of journalism at the moment? And there is a place for it, but it can't be the only thing that we do, because its job is not necessarily to help you make sense of the intersection of problems or the intersection of things that you are living into. So I'm really interested in that. And I think there's also this kind of knock-on challenge, really, for the industry, I suppose. And even describing news as an industry seems problematic, right? This is a public good. It's not an industry. Like, how do we reframe that? But I think there's a challenge around the revenue models associated with how we produce information at the moment. And I think the way that we currently do it incites, divides, and harms us. And I think a lot of that is driven by the revenue model that we use, which is around how many people can you reach with an article. That is the value that we draw from news. We don't draw value from the storytelling, we draw it from the reach. And I think if we can shift that paradigm, where the value is in what is the story doing for the person reading it, then I think we're on to a whole
There's also what's the story doing for the person whose story is being told.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And what's the relationship there? Because there is one. Even
absolutely.
If it's separated by many miles or many hours, there is a relational aspect to that. And it's a value that is completely unseen. It's an invisible value that we just extract from and don't account for.
Well, and sure. And what's the relationship? If I'm exploring your story, James, do I stand as accountability watchdog who's trying to uncover the secrets of nefarious activities that you may or may not be involved in, or am I upset with some tactic you've taken in public, and so I want to develop a reaction to that? Do I perceive what you're doing to be a problem and I want to solve it for you? Or do I wish to be present to what's most alive in you, your giftedness and your talents and the materials and people at hand and what you're cooking up in relationship with all of that, and to encourage and cultivate that story into the open? So yeah, what is the relationship between the person whose craft is to shape stories and the person whose story it is that I'm coming alongside to bring into the light? And if there are that many different kinds of roles for a journalist to play, then part of the practice has got to be, this is how I'm showing up. I am this kind of journalist today. So expect an adversarial relationship, or expect a warm one in which we co-create something together, and to name it. We can't put all these journalisms in a bundle and throw them at people and think that credibility or anything useful is going to come out of it. So there's the role, I think you're right, the naming the relationship, and maybe that's a new function of the byline. If we're meeting with my byline attached, then this is the kind of thing you can expect. Or if you're meeting with a journalist from another school of thought, understand that you'll probably be in a relationship that way.
I think of the different types of journalism as almost different parts of a longer story, right? Mm-hmm, you are deploying different techniques to uncover different parts of that story. Mm-hmm. But I think what's interesting about all of these different forms of journalism is that they ask something of the journalist that is much less like journalism, is much less like a profession, is much less like an objective existence that is detached from the world and offering some kind of neutrality. I think that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that I noticed one of your screens has Sheffield on it. In case I was wondering, well, what's important? What matters? You have declared that the town that you live in is maybe the point. Now, I'm sure you'll cover things all over the world, and you do, because you'll go where the story is. But it just seems to me that in that framing, in that story I read that said maybe that river has rights and has a voice in court. And when did nature lose its voice? Nature used to be the loudest voice when we were not so modern. Nature ruled. And sometimes I think with the climate, nature is wanting its voice back. And but I just love the fact that you decided that Sheffield is worthy. And most places don't lead with that. All the news that's fit the print, the individuals, but no, you care. What does that mean to you that you've declared Sheffield as the point of that piece, that strategy?
The place that I live is hugely important to me.
Why? Aren't you a global citizen? Come on, James.
I am a global citizen. Absolutely. But I'm also just one person. I'm also, my arms and legs only stretch so far. And I think it's really important for lots of reasons to make a difference in the place that you live. And I see it as not just as a kind of as a service, because that rings of martyrdom and a kind of oddness that's unasked for. But I see it as a way of contributing, and I think contributing is really important. And I think when we look at the types of challenge that we face in the decades to come, we're going to find that cities are really, really important in demonstrating how we can behave differently. And we're talking a lot about journalism, and I would not say that I am a journalist, by the way.
Right.
I've played my hand in that trade, and I've started some journalistic projects like Now Then magazine, but I wouldn't define myself as a journalist. I would define myself as somebody who's interested in contributing, and I wouldn't draw any further specialization than that, because I think all of these challenges are intersectional, and I don't think that any particular kind of narrow expertise is going to solve solve them or really generate meaningful responses. I think it's about how we combine, polymathic capabilities where we can.
But I was thinking, James, knowing we were going to be together today, that one thing I think we all have in common is a sense of social architecture and structure. And James, I've convened a collection of containers for certain social purposes. You're a convener and also a designer of spaces and containers where the kind of work that, because there's the role of the journalist in newsmaking and journalism. There's also the role for a publisher and for the organizations themselves. Like, these things are absolutely essential. Without an environment in which journalists can thrive and be supported in their work, their work can't happen. So to convene and design spaces where that work can be done is to be in the craft and in the business, I think, and an important contribution to it. Yeah, and you've convened quite the network and managed to keep them healthy.
Yeah, and retain my own sanity in the process, I hope, as well.
Right.
So
yeah, you can see that's fraying a bit here.
Perhaps. I think it's interesting. You not only report, but you produce experiences. And the thread to me is the word agency or accountability. And I think when you say this, you only have your arms and legs only reach so far. Well, that's the only width in which accountability is possible. I can't be accountable for something beyond my fingertips. I can be interested, I can service it. And I think that to not care about place is an escape from accountability. And that we're creating. And I noticed, in fact, you produce events. And what you're doing is you're creating in a space for a short period of time a world that you want to inhabit. And it's not just entertainment. It's not just gathering. It's not your love of arts and culture. All right. It's also you saying that we can create this place we want to inhabit. And anytime we choose to. You don't want to do it every day because it's exhausting. But I love the way you've integrated the reporting of experience and the producing of experience. And it doesn't cost you your objectivity, because the objectivity is a bit of an illusion. Anyway.
It's a price I'm willing to pay.
Yeah. I mean, the way that we tend to frame the work at the moment at Opus is we tend to think about part of our work is around telling stories. Part of our work is around bringing people together. Part of our work is around demonstrating alternative systems. And the magic is when components of those three areas intersect. When the story that you've told brings people together, when the bringing of people together produces that different architecture, that different way of doing something, that intervention that's collective, that's commons, that's when I think you're on the right track. And so you're right. We're creating containers for some of this work, and it's really exciting. But when you get into the demonstration work, what you find is that, like the River Don project. So we were just talking briefly about that. This is a project very much inspired by other projects and countries around the world who are all trying to understand what's this interface with nature. How can we give voice to this thing that we fundamentally rely on, but fundamentally extract from and make invisible? What's the way of communication that makes sense? That requires great storytelling skills. It requires great skills in convening people, and it requires us to start thinking really deeply about what are the new ontologies, and they're not even new, right? They're old ontologies, but how we repositioning those ontologies of interdependence, of mutuality, of relationships, how we placing those in new architectures, new systems of politics or economy. this is the challenge of the moment. And
one of the things we'd like to do with the live show in particular, is to always be checking in on things that are about to happen or are unfolding now. James, can you say a little bit about what's up next in your work in the world, what's unfolding in the moment, what's clear and present to you now?
I'm really interested in what the new governance systems for neighbourhoods might look like in Sheffield. That's something I'm really passionate about. I think that the closer people are to decisions that affect them, the better the outcome. I think that we don't really have, certainly in the UK, we don't really have a way of understanding rights and responsibilities at neighbourhood level. We don't have a way of issuing resource to neighbourhoods. We don't have a way of neighbourhoods having common ownership. We don't have a methodology that helps neighbourhoods become more resilient in their own right through their own collective effort. I'm really interested in that. It feels like a dependency. The other thing I'm really interested in is public discourse and the lack of honesty in it. Like we should be able to name problems. Exactly. Yeah, which comes from that honesty, right?
Right.
We should be able to name problems. We should be able to change our minds.
Well, and a tolerance for honesty.
Right. And I think these are dependencies.
Right.
These are the capacities that we need.
What sort of ways have you imagined pursuing that interest and that exploration, James?
Well, I guess I think about like where do stories come from and who is telling a story in a city or in a neighborhood.
Right.
I think about...
And if neighborhood stories are even valued at all.
Right.
They seem very, very left behind and forgotten for the most part.
But there's a version of great storytelling that builds power, builds solidarity, builds collective movements. And that is something I'm interested in. And I think some of that is around the different techniques that we use to tell stories with. I think some of that is around who is telling the story and how we equip communities and neighborhoods to be sustainable in telling their own stories. But I also think there's a real conversation here about people that work and live in system. Public discourse is currently largely dictated by a kind of in-system institutional perspective. And those people are kind of trapped in that system. Like
they name it too. It's named.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's something to be done around how we begin to think compassionately about equipping people in system with the courage to do public discourse properly.
All right.
So I'm interested in that as well.
Okay. So as you wade into these endeavors, you can probably see this one coming. What would you like, want, or need from those around you to make those endeavors as wonderfully successful as they possibly could be?
I would say that you have everything that you need, and it's at your fingertips. And we have not equated the social architecture that Peter, you said you learned something about generative. You've been in gatherings, but we take alternative governance as something we do occasionally. Let's have a retreat. Well, retreat means like you want to have a drink. It means let's be in a space where we can be with each other, get connected to each other, tell the truth to each other. And so why don't we take our retreat methodologies and call that governance? And let Robert's rules of order take a nap, a long nap. Let the town meeting rest in peace. All right, let the State of the Union rest in peace. Let people at different heights in a room. We'll take care of that. Just give us a minute. And I like the notion and governance in neighborhoods, because I've been part of my neighborhood governance. Okay, I was an elected official for 6 years in my little town. 9,000 people. And no one was more disconnected from the neighborhood than those on the city council, on the town neighborhood council. And it's in every way, the way we sit. And I, with all my persuasive skills,
considerable ones,
said, okay, can we change the way we meet? They say, absolutely. Why don't we get citizens together? Right now, we let citizens speak in the last 10 minutes of a 2-hour session. Okay, we want some input from you. You have 4 minutes, okay? And every time they say, I said, let's start with small groups. Let's do it. And then they start the meeting and they say, okay, they be in order, and then ignore the alternative. And so there's some real need for what you said, to reimagine governance. And it's a form of self-governance. You know, we have all kinds of open space. We have all kinds of world cafes. We have arts of hosting. We have what I'm calling the common good protocols. You know, what we're living now are the royal protocols. Okay, the way your town governs, the way your neighborhood governs, is based on royalty. You know, and anyway, I think the neighborhood focus is extremely powerful.
So Peter's bought you a lot of time to find your answer to my question, James. So I'll invite it back.
All right, real man.
So
real
I have quite practiced at Robert's Rules, and we have a question on the floor, and so
it's Peter's Rules of Order.
That's right. Of course, in Clearness Committee protocols, which is a common good code protocol, you are perfectly welcome to say, I would rather not answer. But if you'd like to
let him answer.
I'd hold space for it.
So what do I want or need from my community or from the community?
To make those endeavors that you're musing upon as wonderfully successful as they could be.
Something coming up for me about the opportunity to kind of earn the trust, to have the courage. I think we are not short of ideas. That's the wonder of where we are at the moment. The suite of goods that Peter was just referencing there in terms of facilitation skills. There's a range of things that we can deploy in any challenge space that we face. The growth is not the right word, but the capacity to be a better human is up there. That is, and that is a relational exercise. That is not an individual goal. That is not an ambition that I can hold personally. That is something that is a condition of the relationships that I am in and that are part of me. So more of those, please, would be my answer.
Courage and trust in human relations.
And collective capacity. We have a lot of effort into individual capacity. And I think that's powerful in what you said.
Agreed.
And the courage is a great question. The most discomforting question I constantly have to answer is what courage is required of you now. And that's what got me into politics. I was in a small group facilitating other people's learning, which is the ultimate colonial act. And
it's also a great way to excuse yourself from the responsibility yourself. I do it all the time.
And Damon looks at me and says, Peter, what courage is required of you now? And I thought, what came to mind was to be a public figure in my hometown. The willingness to do, I'd gone to other people's towns for years, and I could say anything, and if I failed, I'd just go home. And the first public talk I gave in Cincinnati scared me to death. because everybody that I had a future with was in the room. And
I've heard
that
it
was a
said
great
that,
question. It was just a great question. I think you could ask your team that question, what courage is required of us now. And it always takes you somewhere. I love that question. And so naming courage, I think, is huge. And that's what builds trust.
Yep. I've heard it said that community is what happens when you're stuck with each other. Any idea where I heard that? All right, let's call that closed for our segment with spending some time with James, because Peter, you've got a few things on the go too. So thank you for.
I want more time.
And I do want to. I think it's worth saying that it takes courage to answer that question. What would you like, want, or need from community? To first come up with it, then to own it, and then have the courage to speak it aloud is no small thing. So I thank you for that, James. All right. With that, we've got an invitation that Yvonne will run to Cultivating Community, our fortnightly feast for the soul, one of which actually occurs tomorrow. So check out this invite, and then we'll be back to spend a little bit of time hearing what's alive in the work that Peter is engaged in the world. Thanks, James. Yvonne?
If you would like to experience genuine connection with others, being heard, patience, levity, and laughter, warmth, light, smiles, new, deepening, and healing relationships, then cultivate community with us. Coined by participants as a fortnightly feast for the soul, these 90-minute gatherings hosted by Axiom News offer a weaving of small group dialogue led by carefully crafted questions, followed by light, whole group reflection. Each dialogue round deepens connection and enlivens possibility between and amongst those who participate. All are welcome. Learn more and RSVP for our next gathering by visiting the Events tab in A New Commons, our sister initiative in Mighty Networks, at anewcommons.mn.co/events.
Doesn't that make you feel good?
Well, it's more than that. Yvonne has reimagined graphic recording. Because most of the time, we've had that around, and it's a beautiful way to capture a moment. But by spotlighting and adding music, I saw things on that graphic I wouldn't have seen without it. I'm spoiled now because I'm always overwhelmed by 14 different images. I don't know where to go, so I go nowhere. Now I was mesmerized by the focus. Thank you.
I was also awfully tempted to bring Yvonne into the stream. She's in the background working it all up. Camera's off, so we don't know whether the hairs have been done and makeup on, so I didn't want to do anything surprising, but definitely always appreciate Yvonne's work. And, she calls herself a new narrative artist. And we kind of bring generative journalists and new narrative artists together because art it contains the seeds of the future. It provides us the symbols and the language to understand where we might go, and gives us some shape and some form for what's coming alive in the moment that may or may not be an objective fact. What did I read the other day? I'm a fan of Lin Yutang. Yutang? He says, we're at our best somewhere between fact and fiction.
Where else is there?
Well, that'd be it then, wouldn't it? All right, Peter, I'm going to embarrass you again. You were in Philadelphia, I think, last weekend with a gathering that our friend and colleague Peggy Holman was part of and a supporter in. And of course, she's done wonderful work with Journalism That Matters and Appreciative Inquiry and with libraries, all kinds of great stuff. So I imagine the two of you in that room bearing witness to what was happening there, and the people that were there, what they're cooking up would be, you must have had some insights or an aha or some takeaways. I'd love to hear a little bit about that particular gathering, maybe just to work on from the theme that we've developed with James. And then I would also like to, if you're willing to, explore what you know about the School for the Common Good. So how about Philadelphia? How'd you come away with that?
I had a great time because I had zero accountability. I mean, I had to.
You can see why that's attractive, right?
I had to pinch myself. I was in a room, and most people didn't know who I was, so I was mostly anonymous, and I had no accountability but pick which small group I wanted to go into and be a part of. So that made me happy. And then I was in the room with 100 people, most of whom had chosen journalism as a path, and got out of school, went to work in a newsroom, traditional, and they all couldn't live with it. And so this was a real alternative reimagining group. And the word emergence is, and so that was exciting to see so many people of different ages. And some were from major Philadelphia Inquirer and the Times and Solutions Journalism, all the ones you mentioned, James, were there. And it was delightful to see that there is a spirit and a soul and a force that's so passionate, because people choose journalism. It's right up there with healthcare and saving the world and designing a nuclear weapon. I mean, you have to be really committed to do something like that and a little bit crazy. And that was delightful to me. And then their focus is on neighborhoods.
Was it?
Their focus is on communities.
All right.
And they're as attuned to the racism and colonialism of traditional journalism as anybody I've ever known. And so I felt less lonely being there. And I also enjoyed, they're very focused on race and justice and social stuff. And as a well-off white man, I felt after a while I belonged there. You kind of feel in this world of awareness, like, well, what am I doing here? And I get that a lot. Well, easy for you to say, old white man. And I felt very welcomed by that group, and without them yielding anything about their commitment. So it doubled my importance. I realized, look, they're doing the work, and it matters. And they're going into neighborhoods, they're going to local places, just like you are, James, and finding out what people are doing to what their gifts are. They are against watchdog journalism, even though that's what they studied. That's the career they chose. And they also, it was interesting, two things. One is I was in one group that says, what's beyond voting? Democracy beyond voting, beyond the election. It's too small a version of democracy. And then the 1 hour we had, the first 20 minutes was talking about how to get people to vote. So even those of us that want to go beyond voting have so internalized that the vote matters. And John McNidas always said, among others, that the vote is to give away your power. Now, do I want to vote? Yes. But I thought that was interesting, is how trapped we are, us reformists, in the very world that we're here to reimagine. And I like that forces me to be humble. And anybody that claims victory is a fool. But I just felt that what they pay attention to me is the essence of journalism, or at least the essence of political reform, of cultural reform. And I just think they also value the arts. I don't see how you can. I don't know. It was enlivening to me. And
what were the sorts of things you saw that might be being midwifed by that group and their gathering? What might be what's being born, or what are the seeds of the future that you saw?
What they're doing is they're witnessing. Okay. And witnessing to me is enormously powerful.
Yes.
And they are witnessing means that I see and affirm what you are creating. And they're creating small little things in search of a revenue model. It's hard for them not to talk about money. And they're up against the foundation world. One of the things you're probably doing, James, is reimagining what it means to be a foundation. Okay. and taking your philanthropy suit and leaving it in the closet, all right, and say we're here to build on capacities. They get the gifts versus needs, and so they're looking at everything. They're looking at how an event was held. They're looking at whether a river has a voice. They're looking at renaming what we used to call slums. We used to call, the naming that we have is, it's so powerful. To call somebody poor, they're stopping and calling people underserviced. And they're viewing people
and the business of news and journalism is to publish and publish often. And it's not journalism unless you're publishing. And then every time you publish, if the word slum shows up or the poor shows up, then it's going to reinforce that idea and that narrative in the vernacular and in the community.
And they begin to believe it.
And we all begin to believe it. And as you were saying earlier, James, we start to feel lonely, separated, not whole. And it's our language that's doing it.
And I think it's isolating by design, because you're easy to control if I could make you think that you're not enough. You don't have enough. The consumer mindset is extremely powerful and isolating, and it makes it easier to control.
And James also spoke about, we talked about the structures and the containers. We talked about resource and funding. What's the revenue model? And these are things that have to be grappled with in order for these tools to actually to have the staying power and sustainability necessary to shift the narrative. And then also the role of journalists. And so, Peter, you're saying that what you saw was people intent on bearing witness.
Yes, and feeling extremely vulnerable in doing it. Everybody there, even given the small group and instructions, felt they needed to tell the others, here's what I'm doing and why it's important and what's working, rather than really creating something. There's one little vignette that one group, they decided that the unnamed Philadelphia newspaper, called the Inquirer, decided that they're under pressure for racial equity. So they created basically a minority desk. So they took all their minorities and put them in one spot, and which they thought was, they were here in the conference. And they said, when we report on Arab women, when we report on blacks, we're considered activists. They said when white men report on white men, they don't call them activists, they call them reporters. And I just thought that notion was so powerful. And I really think that I don't have to wait for the journalism that I'm looking for. I found 100 places to find it. And with you, James, I have 104 now because you got so many things going.
I'm really interested in what you were saying about witnessing, Peter, and the power of that. And maybe you could just share a bit more about that.
Well, to witness is an act of affirmation. It says, I'm here to bear witness. It's a spiritual act, all right? And it says that I see you and I affirm whatever it is you are and whatever you're trying to do and your intentions and your gifts and your capacity. And it's an alternative to being a judge, to being a jury, to being a prosecutor. Okay, I'm just here as a witness. Now, witnesses are notoriously unreliable. Okay, so it's not like I'm here to speak truth to power. Save me from speaking truth to power. It's so silly to think what I represent is I want to share my truth. So you hear a lot of funny stuff. But to me, the witness is a neutral moment of compassion. And I come here with no judgment. If I do have a judgment, then I deal with that as my issue. And I don't come to fix. The whole philanthropy world says there's something wrong with you, and I'm here to fix you. and there's turmoil there. That would be a great story in Sheffield, is to explore the dimensions of philanthropy, because it's supposed to be of generosity, but then it gets really funny, and some of it is just our funny relationship with money. And but anyway, back to so that was.
No, thank you.
Yeah, it is, and that's to me the generative word is another term for witnessing. When I bear witness, something gets created, and it wasn't what I had in mind. Save me from somebody having something in mind for me, especially
I know
family
another
members.
very famous and well-read story that goes something very much like that. Peter, you've always been interested in journalism. I credit our shared interest in journalism with our first meeting and that becoming possible. That's been rekindled perhaps by your time in Philadelphia. So can I ask if you have any musings about where you're headed next with regards to your relationship with journalism?
I want to marry it with the governance methodologies, with the gathering methodologies that James mentioned.
Common good protocols, yeah.
The common good protocols. I want to bring them together. I want to stop treating what I've done all these years as an act of facilitation. I want it to be the essence of leadership, that the task of leadership, and so I think that when we choose a story, choose what to pay attention to. A friend of mine was a politician, and I met his dad, and I was going to start a newspaper. Okay, I didn't have the courage, but a local county. And he said, "Well, I know the job I want." And I said, "What's that?" He says, "I want to decide what's news." And wow, that was a huge insight. And so I think, I want to stay in the conversation about what constitutes news. Where should our attention go? I want to draw attention away from the corner office and put it in the neighborhood and say, go ahead.
Imagine instead of saying, I want to decide what's news, you say, I want to decide what to witness.
Beautiful.
Interesting, isn't it? Like
I love it.
Frames the whole output.
Yes.
And the process. And the agency.
Yes, and it does. The agency too on both parties, because when I bear witness, I have a job to do. I have a role to do. And even in the where we're caring for somebody, both sides produce something. And so when I come to your neighborhood, and what used to be called a underserved neighborhood, an isolated, poor neighborhood, a low-income neighborhood, those members of that neighborhood have a job to do. And they can bear witness to each other. And part of what we know how to do is to have people talk to each other and fall in love with each other in 14 minutes. And that's the ultimate requirement for bearing
We've got
witness.
it down to 9.
We have it single-digit love. And so I love that, yeah. Even
we both know
news,
folks.
Walter also told me that the word gospel means news. Well, maybe, and so it is a kind of, but I like the word witnessing. And it has a spiritual and soft quality to it.
Well, there's been some conversation about whether journalism can be a healing art. And,
well, you guys are committed to making it so.
Absolutely. And James, we know a few folks that have, recently embarked on some generative journalism work, and we are hearing back that they are made more whole by bearing witness to others in the way that form of journalism invites. So you are enriched and enlivened and receive the gifts of the other simply by bearing witness in that way. All right, we've got 4 minutes left, so why don't we just invite a bit of reflection from each of you on what's alive for you now, or anything you'd like to say to one another about what you've heard from one another, or what you're leaving with.
I just want to say the words common good. That to me is the most neutral witnessing language I can come up with for what we're about. And it hasn't been politicized yet. All right. And once it does, it will no longer be useful. And I've had that happen to me. I wrote a book on empowerment, and then it became popular. Empowerment became popular. And as soon as it became popular and adopted by the dominant narrative, it was useless. So let's enjoy the common good while we can. And I think if we had more time, or when we do this again, what are the revenue models that are aligned spiritually and operationally and practically with the witnessing kind of journalism that you're talking about? And because what we're doing is changing our relationship with money. We're not finding it from new places. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, I guess from one of our previous calls, used the phrase money is medicine. That's a change relationship. Yep. James?
James, yes.
I'm feeling, feeling like I've received some gifts today. So thank you, both of you, and for the time as well. I entered this conversation with some trepidation, and I feel that was worth it. So thank you. I think something around like how we are exploring the idea of commons as an alternative to the public sector or the private sector is a really interesting thing. How we're combining that idea, as you say, Peter, with witnessing, and how we're redefining our own kind of positionality, I suppose, our own narrative in relation to those different things. How we're thinking about that in terms of stewardship, not in terms of ownership. So those are the things I'm leaving with. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. You know what's staying with me is that Peter, at about the 5 or 7 minute mark, you started to describe all the things that the current and conventional media organizations do not do. And my notion was that if we simply took the words "do not" away and looked at that list again, we would probably have a very clear definition of what our role as publishers, media makers, and journalists might be in a generative sense. So I'm going to check back in on that. Thank you both for being willing to come out and play today and talk about shaping the new narrative and finding the structures and patterns and practices and the ways and means to make all that happen, because this is all the real work for the real world. Thank you both very, very much for all that you're doing.
Thank you
for joining us today. All right.
Thanks, James.
And so with that, I think we'll call our time together closed. You can subscribe below to check in on our usual shows every Thursday at 2 o'clock. You can also find us at axiomnews.com, on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. I'm your host, Peter Pula. Thanks for listening.